By the end of this video, you're going to understand what LT1, LT2, VT2, VO2 Max is, and how these physiological markers change over time. It's going to be really helpful for your training in the future, so I hope you enjoy, and let's get right into it. So the first physiological marker that we're kind of interested in is LT1. And LT1, I've talked about in other threshold videos, it's also known as subthreshold, first lactate threshold, and aerobic threshold. Essentially what it is it's when the lactate rises from above resting levels. So when you first see a noticeable increase, that's LT1. And to put it into more practical terms, it's a very sustainable threshold. We'll get into more details on it later, but as you get fitter, you'll actually notice that there's a more distinct LT1. You might notice that some beginners might not even notice that there is an LT1 because they go through the zones really quickly. Again, I'll explain why later. But when you're doing an LT1 session, it should feel almost too easy. Like that's what it's meant to feel like. It's very, very sustainable. It's also worth noting that it's the first physiological marker that we're going to talk about in this video where you get mixed energy system usage. So that's where the lactate system or the glycolytic system or the intermediate system, all three of them mean the same thing. That's when that kicks in a little bit more to help out with the aerobic system. Also quickly worth noting that LT1 is roughly a pace that you can hold for 2 to 3 hours, but again, there's nuance to it. It actually depends on the level of your ability as well. So take that into account, but yeah, roughly 2 to 3 hour pace. LT1 is also a great physiological marker where a lot of the aerobic adaptations are really happening. It's a relatively easy effort and we can do it for a long amount of time, so we're getting a lot of benefits like capillarization, increased stroke volume, increased heart muscle contraction and contractility, mitochondrial density, and all these factors that I talk about quite often, especially with the aerobic system. And this is why training methods like the Norwegian singles is getting really popular, because you're getting that real adaptation that helps you in the long term, because having those adaptations just makes you so much more efficient going forward. So it's something that's really important to work on, and I think it will help every runner out there. So now we're going to talk about the next physiological marker, which is LT2. We all know that over time lactate accumulates and it's harder to clear it as the intensity gets higher. And essentially when that lactate accumulation becomes exponential, that's when you know you've hit LT2. LT2 is right before it goes exponential. Now to put that into more practical terms, this is something that we can sustain for about 45 to 60 minutes. It's also known as MLSS, onset of blood lactate accumulation, OBLA, or LT2, second lactate threshold, anaerobic threshold. All of them are referring to the same thing. This is the classic threshold that you hear about all the time that everyone talks about. Not as many people talk about LT1, but LT2 everyone knows about. This is the sort of intensity where you can get a few words here and there in, but you can't really speak full sentences. So you're noticeably working a little bit harder, but it's definitely still sustainable. It doesn't feel like you're redlining. I would just think of it as it's right before the pace where it suddenly feels like redline. So you are working fairly hard. It is fairly high intensity. One other important thing to know about LT2 is that velocity at threshold or velocity at LT2 really matters. You can have two athletes where their LT2 in their graph is roughly the same amount of millimoles. So that might be, for a typical person about 4 millimoles. But 4 millimoles means absolutely nothing in practical concept if you're only running like 430 per kilometer at 4 millimoles compared to a professional runner who's running like 315 per kilometer, or even faster obviously if you're professional, at 4 millimoles. They're both the same blood lactate value, but one of them is running way quicker. So it's not just about blood lactate, it's about how fast you can run at threshold, which is what I mean by velocity at threshold. So velocity at threshold is actually the biggest indicator for performance in endurance running when you take away race tactics and other uncontrollable factors. So 9 times out of 10, when there's not some crazy tactics going on in the race, you're probably going to notice that the person with the highest speed at lactate threshold is probably going to win the race, just because they're going to feel the freshest and they haven't accumulated hydrogen ions, which makes their legs feel a little bit heavier. So now we're going to be talking about VO2 Max, and I've talked about VO2 Max in a whole video before, so go check that out if you haven't yet. I might make an updated video for that as well in the future. But essentially VO2 Max is the maximum amount of oxygen you can use at a given intensity, and we're talking about a pretty high intensity, but not all out. So you're going to be breathing extremely hard, and if you go any higher than that in terms of intensity, your oxygen consumption will not go up because you're already absorbing and using as much oxygen as possible at that period. So eventually the other systems can't sustain forever, because as we talked about in a previous video recently, the lactate system and the immediate energy system, they can't produce a huge amount of energy constantly because their energy yield is way lower than the aerobic system. They can't sustain that for longer. That's why VO2 max is basically the ceiling of aerobic activity, where aerobic system kind of dominates and really helps out. So this is an intensity that you can hold for roughly 6 to 8 minutes. Depends on the athlete as well, of course, but it's a pretty hard effort. And the final thing I will say about VO2 max is that endurance performance isn't really about how high your VO2 max is. We all talk about it all the time. Kipchoge probably doesn't have the highest VO2 max, but he is able to hold like 90% of his VO2 max for a longer period of time, and that's what sets him apart. So yes, it is helpful to increase your VO2 max because you're kind of raising the roof and you're adding a bit more potential in terms of threshold and whatever. So we are trying to have that raised ceiling so that you can actually have the potential to increase your threshold, but endurance performance comes from that LT2. And that ties in nicely with what I was saying earlier about how velocity at LT2 is what matters most in endurance running when you take away race tactics. So I hope it's all tying together a bit better. And again, VO2 max is to do with oxygen consumption. It has nothing to do with blood lactate. It's just another physiological marker which happens to happen after LT2, because at LT2 you're probably not breathing hard. Somewhere between LT2 and VO2 max is when you hit VT2, and VT2 is referring to ventilatory threshold, which is where your breathing becomes exponential. So shortly after your breathing becomes exponential, that's probably where you're hitting VO2 max. You're using the maximum amount of oxygen you can at that given moment at that high intensity, and you're not going to be able to increase your oxygen consumption anymore because you're limited there. So you're starting to reach the limits of how long you can hold that hard intensity for. Now the final intensity that we're going to talk about, which I wouldn't really say is a physiological marker, but it's essentially top end speed, the absolute all-out running that you can do, and that's talking about neuromuscular stuff. So it's purely anaerobic. There's pretty much no aerobic contribution to it, or almost none. There's always going to be a little bit, of course, but you're running so fast that it's raw natural speed. And it is useful because if you can run with really good form when you're running completely all out, it does help you clean up the form a little bit for all the subsequent physiological markers. So your running form will be smoother at VO2 max, your running form will be smoother at LT2, which all helps with running economy. And running economy is defined as the energy cost to maintain a certain intensity. So if you're running with efficient form and you're recruiting the right muscle fibers, you're probably not expending as much energy to maintain that pace, and therefore your velocity at LT2, velocity at VO2 max is going to be quicker, and that's what's defined as high or efficient running economy. So this is what people like Eliud Kipchoge has. He has very high running economy, and therefore he doesn't have a lot of wasted energy expenditure. Every single energy that he produces in his body is going towards really efficient running form and getting him from A to B as fast as possible. So that's the basic part of the video done. We've defined the physiological markers, and now we're about to go into detail on how these physiological markers spread out over time depending on how fit you get. Before we do that though, leave a like and comment below. It does help the algorithm a lot, and also subscribing and sharing the channel to your friends really means a lot as well. As of now, statistics are telling me that 2/3 of you are not subscribed, and if you want to get more content like this, you should definitely subscribe, so join the army. So now that we've defined the different physiological markers, let's look at this graph and try and work out what's happening here. So at the top we have an advanced runner, at the bottom we have a beginner runner, and on the y-axis we have the physiological markers, so easy, LT1, LT2, VO2 max. The x-axis is the time, so the further you go along, the more time has passed. So let's start off with a beginner runner. So let me fold this in half. Hopefully I don't mess up this paper. Okay, now I kind of regret folding this, but whatever. So obviously I'm not putting any unit of measurement right here because VO2 max is measured in milliliters per kilogram per minute, and then LT2 is measured in millimoles, because lactate, same with LT1, and then easy could be heart rate or VO2 or whatever. So like, there's no point putting the unit of measurement. You can just think of it as physiological marker or effort or intensity, whatever you want to call it. So let's try and understand what's happening here. Let's say a beginner goes out too quick in a 5K. They're going to cross the easy physiological marker, which might be known as zone 2 or lower zone 2, and then they might hit LT1 or upper zone 2 pretty quickly, and then they'll hit LT2 pretty quickly, and then they'll hit VO2 max very, very early into the run because they've gone out too quick. So let's just say they went out 110% too quick. If we go into an advanced runner, we can see that the spread of the physiological markers are a bit different. They're more further apart here, and then they get crammed at the top. That's what I've talked about a few times in previous videos, and that's because they push their threshold up. They've done a lot of threshold training, and it's really close to their VO2 max. So they have a huge aerobic base, and that's what I'm referring to, the gap between the lines here. And therefore, if they go out at 110% pace, and by the way, this is the gradient of this, and this is the same. I made sure it's the exact same angle to make it a fair test. Basically, because their base is huge, they take longer to hit LT1 even though they went 110% too quick. And they take longer to hit LT2 even though they went 110% too quick. And they take longer to hit VO2 max even though they went 110% too quick. So both of these runners have gone out way too quick in a 5K to the same percentage to make it fair, but the advanced runner takes longer to get there. And this is why a lot of elite runners, even if they're pushing really hard, they actually seem to be looking a bit more comfortable compared to a beginner runner who goes out too quick. Technically, the fitter you get, even though you're struggling a little more, it's still going to look kind of easy. So that's the interesting bit. But just to compare the two now, you can see that these are evenly spread apart and they don't have much of a base. It's quite small, like it doesn't take long for the lactic or glycolytic system that we talked about in the other video to kick in and help out and contribute more. So they have like less of an aerobic base that they can rely on. Whereas the advanced runner takes way longer to start utilizing the other energy systems. So until here, we're very aerobic. And we finally hit a little bit more contribution from the other energy systems there. So you can see that the advanced runner hits VO2 max later than the beginner runner who hits VO2 max earlier. So that's what this part of the graph is showing with the red lines. It's kind of hard to see. But I hope this visual diagram makes a bit of sense. And this is exactly what I mean by if you do push that threshold up and move it closer to the ceiling, you are going to struggle less for those aerobic events because you're staying aerobic for so long before you overcook it. And keep in mind, both of these runners here, they're both going too quick. Imagine if they were conservative. They're going to stay in their base for ages. But this person, even if they go conservative, they will stay in their base for ages, but they're going to start accumulating lactate a little bit quicker than this guy. And you can see the roof is obviously bigger here as well. Like the VO2 max is higher for this guy clearly, but this person's VO2 max is a bit lower. But you could shift your threshold up, but then if you're a beginner runner, you probably have more work to do in terms of VO2 max and pushing that ceiling up as well, pushing that aerobic ceiling. So yeah, there's a lot going on here. I think I'll use future videos to elaborate a little bit more, but that's a little bit of a rundown on the physiological markers of an advanced runner versus a beginner runner. So now that we have a good understanding of the physiological markers and how it changes as you get fitter, let's wrap up the video and talk about the key takeaways from this video. The first thing I want you to know is that these physiological markers, there are a little bit of overlap. It's not really distinct. In reality, it is like all jumbled apart, and you will get a little bit of benefits from either end of that physiological marker. So LT1, you're getting that easy run benefit, but you're also getting that lactate buffering benefit. With LT2, you're probably getting that little bit of biomechanical speed benefit, but also that lactate buffering benefit. So we need to get out of the mindset that we're going from one gear to another gear to another gear. It's like really smooth gearing throughout. And that's why it's important to remember that when you do a threshold workout, it's totally fine, and most people naturally do this anyway. They start at LT1 and at the end they're closer to LT2. So when I do a threshold workout, I'm always probably sitting somewhere between LT1 and LT2 for majority of the workout. I might be closer to LT2 by the end of the workout. I might have been closer to LT1 at the start of the workout, but that's fine because I'm getting the benefit from both ends of the spectrum. So to all the generous people that have watched the whole video so far, I'm going to give you this one little bonus tip which you guys might appreciate. And it's pretty basic, but essentially the tip is to remember that the body is smart and the body knows that when you add the stress to it, it needs to adapt. So if you add a lot of VO2 max sessions in a VO2 max block, it's telling your body, hey, your body needs to be able to absorb more oxygen and use it efficiently, and therefore you're going to need to adapt somehow. So the body is going to go through those adaptation processes, and then you're going to be fitter in 6 to 8 weeks time when you do a VO2 max block, because you've added adequate amount of stress with adequate amount of recovery to allow the supercompensation and adaptations to happen. So try and think about the benefits of each type of physiological marker and make sure you're getting a little bit of everything in throughout a year. You don't need to do VO2 max the whole year. I made a whole video on that, but as long as you understand this simple physiological concept, I think your running training will change a lot. Add the right stimulus and get the right adaptation. Now, as always, if this video is super helpful, please leave a like, comment below, and share it with your friends. It really means a lot when you spread the word and share the channel to other people, because it helps them grow the channel and gives me more opportunities in the future. And it also keeps me motivated to make more videos, because I know that I'm helping out a lot of people people out there. And I know I mentioned this in a lot of videos, and I'm sure people are fed up of hearing it, but I am currently a student and I'm going through placements and they're not paid, so I'm working full-time at a hospital and not getting paid at all. And this YouTube channel is keeping me afloat as well. So any support and donations on Buy Me a Coffee is really appreciated. Thank you so much to all these donors right here. It really means a lot that you guys are helping me out, and it literally is feeding me and keeping me going. But either way, I really appreciate everyone that watches the videos, especially people watching all the way to the end, and I hope to see you in the next one.